It was a bright morning in the heart of the city, where history whispered through the cobblestone streets, and towering landmarks stood as silent witnesses to time. The air was alive with the hum of tourists, cameras clicking as they captured the majesty of a palace that had stood for centuries. At the gates, tall and imposing, stood the royal guards, their polished uniforms shining under the sun, their faces unreadable masks of duty and tradition. Among them was Sir Henry, a veteran guard known for his unyielding discipline and strict adherence to rules. His stoic demeanor was both admired and feared by his peers. But beneath the surface of his carefully crafted exterior was a man whose biases were deeply rooted and rarely challenged. Amidst the crowd that gathered to watch the changing of the guard, a woman stood out, not because she sought attention, but because she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her name was Naomi. Heavily pregnant, her radiant glow shone brighter than the morning sun, and her every step spoke of resilience. Naomi wasn't here as a tourist. This visit was deeply personal. She had grown up hearing stories of the palace and its grandeur from her late grandmother, who had always dreamed of seeing it herself. Naomi was here to honor that dream. She moved slowly, one hand resting on her belly, as she carefully navigated the throng of people. Henry, stationed at the gate, scanned the crowd with practiced precision. To him, everyone was a potential threat, a disturbance to the sanctity of the palace. His gaze fell on Naomi, and something about her presence seemed to irk him. Was it her hesitant movements, the way she seemed out of place amidst the eager tourists? Or was it something he wouldn't dare admit to himself? Whatever it was, his focus sharpened as she approached the gate. Naomi, unaware of Henry's watchful eyes, paused to catch her breath near the entrance. She reached into her bag for a bottle of water, her movements slow and deliberate. A small child brushed past her, giggling as he chased a pigeon, and Naomi smiled, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. It was a simple human moment, a fleeting connection between a mother and a child she had yet to meet. But to Henry, it looked like hesitation, like someone who didn't belong trying to find a way in. As Naomi stepped closer, she stopped to admire the intricate design of the gates, marveling at the craftsmanship. A passerby accidentally bumped into her, and she stumbled slightly, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the gate. That was all Henry needed. His training had conditioned him to act quickly, to prevent disruptions at all costs. In his mind, Naomi's movements were a breach of protocol, a step too far. Without a word of warning, Henry moved forward, his presence towering over Naomi. She looked up, startled, her eyes meeting his cold, unflinching gaze. "Step back," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Naomi, confused and slightly frightened, tried to explain. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." But Henry didn't let her finish. "This is not a place for loitering," he snapped, his tone laced with an authority that brooked no argument. Before Naomi could react, he reached out and gave her a firm push, enough to make her stumble back a few steps. The world seemed to pause in that moment. The murmurs of the crowd fell silent as heads turned to witness the exchange. Naomi caught herself, her hand instinctively cradling her belly, her face a mixture of shock and hurt. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief. An elderly woman in the crowd clutched her chest, muttering, "Oh dear Lord, is that really necessary?" A young man pulled out his phone, recording the incident with a frown. Naomi's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The humiliation, the sting of being treated so harshly in front of a crowd, was overwhelming. Her breath hitched, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. But then she straightened her back, her eyes meeting Henry's once more, not with fear, but with quiet defiance. Henry, however, was unbothered. To him, this was just another day, another incident dealt with swiftly and decisively. He turned back to his post, the faintest trace of satisfaction in his expression. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was the ripple effect of his actions. The crowd, once merely spectators, began to murmur amongst themselves. Phones were raised, capturing the aftermath, and whispers of, "Did you see what he did?" And "She's pregnant, for God's sake," spread like wildfire. And Naomi, she wasn't the type to cause a scene. But she wasn't one to let an injustice go unanswered either. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her bag, her heart pounding not just from the encounter, but from the resolve building within her. She had come here to honor her grandmother's dream, not to be shoved aside as if she were invisible. As the crowd began to disperse, their expressions ranging from concern to indignation, one man stepped forward. Dressed in a tailored suit, his presence exuded authority. He was tall, with sharp features and a gaze that seemed to see everything. He had been watching from a distance, unnoticed by Henry or the others. And now he approached Naomi, his steps deliberate, his expression unreadable. "Are you all right, madam?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Naomi hesitated, glancing at Henry before nodding slowly. "I'm fine," she said softly, though her eyes betrayed her. The man turned his gaze to Henry, who straightened instinctively, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. There was something about this man that commanded respect, or perhaps fear. What happened next would change everything. The man's eyes locked on Henry, and for the first time, the stoic guard faltered. There was something unnerving about this stranger. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the brewing tension in the air. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle everyone around him. When he finally addressed Henry, his words were measured, but there was an edge to them that couldn't be ignored. "Is this how you represent the palace?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. Henry stiffened, his grip tightening on the ceremonial staff he held. "Sir, I was simply ensuring the rules were followed," he replied, his voice steady, but lacking the confidence it carried moments ago. The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting briefly to Naomi, who stood a few steps away, her hand still protectively on her belly. "She's pregnant," he said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "Does enforcing the rules include shoving vulnerable women?" Henry opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. The weight of the man's question hung in the air, and the murmurs from the crowd grew louder. The onlookers, emboldened by the stranger's presence, began to voice their opinions more openly. "He didn't have to push her," someone called out. "That was out of line," another added. Naomi, who had been silent up until now, took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her voice was soft but steady. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she said, her eyes flickering between Henry and the man. "I was just trying to steady myself. I didn't think it would turn into this." Her words were laced with a quiet sadness that made the crowd fall silent again. The man turned his attention back to her, his expression softening. "You don't need to apologize," he said gently. "You did nothing wrong." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "My name is Robert. I work with the palace administration." Henry's face paled slightly at the mention of Robert's affiliation with the palace. While Robert wasn't wearing a uniform, his presence carried a weight that even Henry couldn't dismiss. Naomi nodded, her expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. But Robert wasn't done. He turned back to Henry, his gaze hardening once more. "You might want to consider how your actions reflect on the institution you serve," he said, his words deliberate. "The palace doesn't tolerate behavior that disrespects or harms visitors, especially those who are vulnerable." Henry swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. He was used to dealing with unruly tourists, with people who didn't respect the sanctity of the palace grounds. But this was different. He hadn't expected to be called out so publicly, and certainly not by someone like Robert. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their interest shifting elsewhere as the tension seemed to subside. But Naomi remained rooted in place, her mind racing. This wasn't how her day was supposed to go. She had come here to find a connection to her grandmother, to create a memory she could share with her child one day. Instead, she found herself at the center of an incident that left her feeling exposed and unsettled. Robert seemed to sense her unease. "Do you have someone here with you?" he asked, his tone gentle. Naomi shook her head. "No, I came alone," she admitted. "I didn't think it would be a problem." Of course it's not a problem, Robert said firmly. You have every right to be here. He paused, glancing at Henry one last time, before turning back to Naomi. Why don't you come with me for a moment? I'll make sure you're all right. Naomi hesitated. She wasn't sure if she wanted to leave the area, to step away from the crowd that had now thinned out considerably. But something about Robert's demeanor made her feel safe, like he was someone she could trust. After a moment's pause, she nodded. As they walked away from the gate, Naomi found herself opening up to Robert, telling him about her grandmother and the reason for her visit. Robert listened intently, his expression softening as she spoke. She always talked about this place, Naomi said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. She never got to see it herself, but she used to tell me stories about what it must be like. I wanted to come here for her, in a way. Robert nodded thoughtfully. It's a beautiful sentiment, he said. And I'm sorry your visit was overshadowed by what happened. That shouldn't have been your experience. Naomi gave a small smile, appreciating his kindness. But even as she spoke with Robert, her mind lingered on Henry. She couldn't shake the image of his cold, unyielding expression, the way he had looked at her as if she didn't belong. It wasn't just the physical push that bothered her. It was the dismissal, the way he had reduced her to nothing more than a problem to be dealt with. Robert seemed to pick up on her lingering thoughts. Henry has been with the guard for a long time, he said, as if reading her mind. He's set in his ways, but that doesn't excuse his behavior. Naomi nodded slowly, her thoughts swirling. She wanted to move on, to put the incident behind her. But a part of her couldn't let it go. Not just for herself, but for others who might face similar treatment. Do you think he'll face any consequences? She asked quietly. Robert hesitated, choosing his words carefully. That depends, he said. Incidents like this don't go unnoticed, but sometimes it takes more than just words to create change. Naomi pondered his response as they continued walking. She wasn't sure what she could do, if there was anything she could do, but the idea of staying silent didn't sit well with her. She had always believed in standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. As they reached a quieter part of the palace grounds, Robert stopped and turned to her. If you're comfortable, I'd like to take your statement, he said. It's important that incidents like this are documented. Naomi nodded, her resolve strengthening. All right, she said. Let's do it. As Robert pulled out a small notebook and pen, Naomi began to recount the events in detail. Her voice was steady, but there was a fire in her eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. And as she spoke, she couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning of something much bigger than she had anticipated. Naomi sat on a small stone bench near the manicured hedges of the palace gardens, her hands resting on her belly as she gathered her thoughts. Robert was seated beside her, pen poised over his notebook, waiting patiently. The warmth of the sun had shifted to a more subdued glow, casting long shadows across the garden paths. Naomi took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs as she tried to articulate the emotions swirling within her. It wasn't just the push, she began, her voice quiet but steady. It was the way he looked at me. Like I was a nuisance, like I didn't belong here. She paused, glancing at Robert to gauge his reaction. He nodded for her to continue, his face a mask of quiet attentiveness. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I just needed a moment to steady myself, she went on. But the way he reacted, it felt like he didn't even see me as a person, just someone in the way. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, and she swallowed hard, willing herself to stay composed. Robert jotted down notes, his pen moving quickly over the page. I understand, he said after a moment. It's important we get everything down, not just the facts, but how it made you feel. These things matter. He glanced up, meeting her eyes. Your voice matters. Naomi felt a flicker of gratitude, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Henry. She wondered what kind of person he was beyond the rigid uniform and stern demeanor. Had he always been this way, or had years of service hardened him into someone who saw the world in black and white? She couldn't shake the sense that there was more to him, though she wasn't sure why she cared. Meanwhile, back at the gates, Henry stood at his post, the weight of the earlier encounter pressing down on him. He was used to dealing with difficult situations, but something about this one lingered. The image of Naomi's face, the shock and hurt in her eyes, kept replaying in his mind. He had acted on instinct, the same instinct that had served him well for years, and yet, for the first time, he felt a twinge of doubt. His colleague, a younger guard named Liam, approached him during a lull in the crowd. "Everything all right, Henry?" Liam asked, his tone casual, but laced with curiosity. He had witnessed the incident from a distance and had heard the murmurs among the tourists. Henry shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Just doing my job," he said gruffly. Liam hesitated, then pressed on. "You know, people were talking about it. That woman, she's pregnant. Maybe it could have been handled differently." Henry shot him a sharp look. "And what would you know about it, Liam? You've been here, 2 years? You don't understand the kind of vigilance this job requires." His tone was defensive, and Liam wisely chose not to push further. But as he walked away, Henry couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had taken root in his chest. As the day wore on, news of the incident began to spread among the palace staff. It wasn't long before it reached the ears of Eleanor, the palace's public relations officer. Eleanor was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had spent years navigating the delicate balance between maintaining the palace's image and addressing the realities of public scrutiny. When Robert brought the incident to her attention, she listened carefully, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This isn't the first time we've had complaints about Henry," Robert said, leaning back in his chair. "But this one feels different. There's video circulating and people are talking about it online." He handed Eleanor his notebook, where he had transcribed Naomi's account of the event. Eleanor scanned the pages, her expression unreadable. "This could become a bigger issue if we don't handle it carefully," she said finally. "The last thing we need is for this to blow up in the media." She tapped the edge of the notebook thoughtfully. "We need to speak with both parties, and Henry needs to understand the gravity of the situation." Robert nodded, relieved that Eleanor was taking it seriously. "Naomi's not the type to seek attention," he said. "She just wants to be treated with respect. And honestly, she deserves an apology." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Let's see if Henry is willing to give one. If not, we may have bigger problems." Back in the gardens, Naomi was beginning to feel the weight of the day. Her feet ached, and the emotional toll of the encounter was catching up to her. Robert noticed and offered to escort her to a quieter area where she could rest more comfortably. As they walked, he asked her more about her life, trying to lighten the mood. "I work as a school counselor," Naomi said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's not always easy, but it's rewarding. I like helping kids find their way, especially when they're going through tough times." Robert nodded, impressed. "That takes a lot of patience," he said, "and a lot of heart." Naomi shrugged modestly. "I just try to be there for them. Sometimes all someone needs is to feel seen and heard." Her words lingered with Robert, echoing the very issue at the heart of the day's events. Naomi's simple statement held a truth that felt uncomfortably relevant, not just for Henry, but for so many others who had grown numb to the humanity in the people they encountered. Meanwhile, Henry found himself called to a private meeting with Eleanor. She wasted no time getting to the point. "Henry, we've received a formal complaint regarding your conduct earlier today," she said, her tone professional but firm. "This isn't the first time your approach has been questioned. I need you to be honest with me. Do you think you handled the situation appropriately?" Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I acted according to protocol," he said defensively. She was leaning on the gate. "That's a security concern." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "And do you think shoving a pregnant woman is part of our protocol? Because if it is, we need to have a much bigger conversation." Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, Eleanor sighed. "Henry, this isn't just about protocol. It's about perception, about how we treat the people who come here. This woman wasn't a threat. She was a visitor, a human being." Henry looked down at his hands, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, he began to question his actions, not just the shove, but the assumptions he had made about Naomi in that moment. As the palace staff worked to address the situation, Naomi found herself reflecting on what had happened. She didn't want to dwell on the negative, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was part of a larger issue. Her thoughts were interrupted by a notification on her phone. A friend had sent her a link to a video, one of the many clips recorded by bystanders during the incident. Naomi hesitated before pressing play. Watching the events unfold from a different perspective was surreal. The video captured everything: the shove, a stumble, and the expressions of the crowd. But what stood out to her most was the look on Henry's face. It wasn't anger or malice. It was something else, something she couldn't quite put into words. As the video ended, Naomi's resolve solidified. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let this moment define her. It was time to take a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt invisible. And so, with a deep breath, she began to write. Naomi sat in her small apartment later that evening, the soft hum of her air conditioner filling the silence as she stared at her laptop. The video of the incident played again on her screen, but this time she wasn't watching for herself. She was looking for something else, something in Henry's expression that she hadn't caught before. There was a flicker, barely noticeable but undeniably there. Was it regret? Uncertainty? She couldn't be sure. Her phone buzzed at the table beside her, pulling her attention away. It was a message from Robert. "I've spoken to the palace administration. They're taking this seriously. I'll keep you updated," it read. She appreciated his dedication, but the message didn't bring the comfort she had hoped for. The events of the day had left her with more questions than answers. What would happen next? Would Henry be held accountable? Or would this incident be swept under the rug like so many others? Across the city, Henry sat alone in his modest flat, the dim light from a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. The day's events replayed in his mind, each moment more vivid than the last. He could still hear the crowd's murmurs, feel the weight of Robert's disapproving gaze. But what lingered most was Naomi's face, the way her eyes had brimmed with a mix of fear and hurt, emotions he hadn't stopped to consider in the heat of the moment. For the first time in years, Henry felt the need to look inward. His job as a royal guard had always been his identity, his shield against the world. But today, that shield felt like it was cracking. He reached for his phone and hesitated, his thumb hovering over the contact list. He didn't know what he was looking for. An apology, perhaps, or some way to make amends, but the thought of reaching out terrified him. The next morning, Naomi received an unexpected call from Eleanor. The palace's public relations officer sounded professional, but carried a tone of urgency. "Naomi, I'd like to invite you to the palace tomorrow," Eleanor said. "We're organizing a meeting to address what happened, and I think it's important that your voice is heard." Naomi's heart raced. She hadn't anticipated being brought into the fold so directly. "A meeting?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Who will be there?" "Robert, myself, and Henry, among others," Eleanor replied. "We believe it's essential to have an open dialogue about what happened and how we can move forward. I understand if you're hesitant, but I encourage you to consider it." Naomi agreed, though the prospect of confronting Henry face to face left her uneasy. She spent the rest of the day preparing herself, replaying the incident in her mind and jotting down her thoughts. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about challenging a system that allowed moments like this to occur unchecked. When the day of the meeting arrived, Naomi felt a mix of determination and anxiety as she stepped into the grand conference room within the palace walls. The room was smaller than she expected, the ornate furniture and polished wood giving it a sense of formality that only heightened her nerves. Robert greeted her with a reassuring smile, guiding her to a seat near the center of the table. Henry entered moments later, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. He avoided Naomi's gaze as he took his seat across from her. Eleanor followed, along with a few other palace staff members. The air was thick with tension, and Naomi could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Eleanor began the meeting, her voice steady and authoritative. "We're here today to address the events that took place at the gates 2 days ago," she said. "This is an opportunity for us to listen, to reflect, and to find a path forward." She turned to Naomi first, inviting her to share her perspective. Naomi took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I came to the palace that day to connect with a part of my family's history," she began. "It was supposed to be a moment of peace, of reflection. But instead, I felt dismissed, disrespected, and frankly, unsafe." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. "I understand that the guards have a job to do, and I respect that. But I don't think it should come at the expense of someone's dignity." The room was silent as Naomi finished speaking, her words hanging heavily in the air. Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Naomi," she said. Then, turning to Henry, she added, "Henry, would you like to respond?" Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands resting on the polished surface of the table. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he began, his voice low. "I was doing what I thought was right in the moment. But looking back, I can see that I handled it poorly." He hesitated, his gaze finally lifting to meet Naomi's. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that caught her off guard. "I made a mistake, and for that, I apologize." The apology hung in the air, a fragile offering that felt both significant and insufficient. Naomi studied his face, searching for signs of authenticity. There was something in his eyes, regret perhaps, or a desire to make things right. But before she could respond, Robert spoke up. "It's not just about this one incident," he said, his tone firm. "It's about creating an environment where moments like this don't happen again. Henry, you've been with the Guard for a long time. Do you think there's room for change in how we approach situations like this?" Henry hesitated, the question catching him off guard. I don't know," he admitted, "but maybe it's time to find out." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. Naomi felt a flicker of hope, though she knew the road ahead would be long and complicated. This wasn't just about Henry's actions. It was about a culture that needed to evolve, one step at a time. And as the meeting continued, she realized that her voice was just the beginning of that change. As the meeting drew to a close, Naomi felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Henry's apology had been unexpected, and while it was a step in the right direction, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. The palace staff seemed genuinely committed to addressing the issue, but there was an undercurrent of tension that lingered in the air. It was as if everyone was waiting for something else to happen, for the next shoe to drop. Eleanor stood to thank everyone for attending, but before she could formally conclude the meeting, one of the palace staff members, an older man named Thomas, cleared his throat. "Before we finish," he began, his voice steady but laced with urgency, "there's something else I believe we need to discuss." All eyes turned to him, curiosity and apprehension spreading through the room. Thomas shifted in his seat, his hands clasped tightly together. "During my review of the security logs and visitor footage from that day," he continued, "I came across something unusual." Naomi felt her breath hitch as a wave of unease washed over her. Henry's expression hardened, and even Eleanor's calm demeanor faltered slightly. Thomas reached into a folder and pulled out a series of printed images, placing them on the table for everyone to see. The images showed a man lurking near the palace gates, his face partially obscured by a hood. He wasn't in any of the usual tourist spots, and his presence seemed deliberate, almost calculated. "This individual was seen near the gates just moments before the incident with Naomi," Thomas explained. "And while we haven't identified him yet, his behavior raises some red flags." Naomi leaned forward, studying the images closely. The man's posture was tense, his movements captured mid-step, as though he were watching something or someone. A chill ran down her spine as she realized how close he had been to where she had stood that day. "What does this have to do with the incident?" Henry asked, his tone sharp. It was clear he was trying to understand why this was being brought up now. Thomas hesitated before replying. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted. "But there's a possibility this man was observing Naomi specifically. It could be a coincidence, but given the timing, I think it's worth looking into. The room fell silent, the weight of Thomas's revelation sinking in. Naomi felt a knot form in her stomach. Was this just a random passerby, or was there more to it? And if he had been watching her, why? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Eleanor was the first to break the silence. "We need to investigate this further," she said firmly. "Thomas, coordinate with security and see if we can track this man down." "Naomi, I understand this might be overwhelming, but we'll do everything we can to ensure your safety." Naomi nodded, though the reassurance did little to ease her growing sense of dread. She had come to the palace seeking connection and peace, but instead she had found herself entangled in something far more complicated and potentially dangerous. As the staff dispersed, Eleanor pulled Naomi aside. "I know this is a lot to process," she said, her voice softening, "but I want you to know we're taking this seriously. If you feel unsafe or notice anything unusual, please let us know immediately." Naomi thanked her, though her thoughts were racing too fast to fully process the conversation. She left the palace feeling a strange mix of vulnerability and determination. If there was more to this story, she was going to find out what it was. Meanwhile, Henry lingered in the conference room, staring at the images on the table. The sight of the hooded man unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. His instincts, honed over years of service, told him this wasn't just a random coincidence. He replayed the events of that day in his mind, trying to remember if he had noticed anything unusual at the gates. But his memory was clouded by the confrontation with Naomi, and the details felt slippery, just out of reach. As he left the room, his thoughts returned to Naomi. He had misjudged her once, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that she was caught up in something much larger than either of them realized. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of responsibility, not just for his actions, but for the role he could play in uncovering the truth. That night, Naomi sat by her window, staring out at the city lights. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer, and a sense of unease settled over her like a heavy blanket. She thought about the man in the images, about the way he had lingered near the gates. Who was he, and what did he want? As she pondered these questions, a sudden knock at her door made her jump. Her heart raced as she approached the door, peering through the peephole. It was Robert. She opened the door, relief washing over her. "Sorry for dropping by unannounced," he said, his expression serious. "But there's something you need to see." He handed her his phone, where a grainy video was paused on the screen. "This was sent to me anonymously," he explained. "It shows the same man from the photos, but this time he's following you." Naomi's blood ran cold as she pressed play. The video showed her walking through the palace gardens, completely unaware of the hooded man several steps behind her. He didn't approach, didn't say anything, he just watched, his movements deliberate and calculated. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about the incident at the gates anymore. Someone had been watching her, tracking her movements. And as the weight of that truth settled in, Naomi knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. Naomi stared at the video on Robert's phone, her breath shallow and her thoughts a chaotic swirl. The hooded man's presence was no longer an abstract threat. It was a chilling reality. She felt exposed, a sense of safety crumbling with every second that passed. Robert placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his expression firm but kind. "We're going to figure this out," he said, his voice steady. "You're not alone in this." The next day, Naomi was back at the palace, meeting with Eleanor, Thomas, and a security team. The atmosphere was tense, every movement deliberate as they reviewed the footage and pieced together what they knew. The hooded man had been spotted on multiple cameras, always staying just out of clear view, but never far from Naomi. It was clear he wasn't there by chance. "We've cross-referenced the footage with visitor logs," Thomas announced, his tone grim. "It seems this man used a fake identity to gain access to the palace grounds. Whoever he is, he's gone to great lengths to remain anonymous." Henry, who had been silent for much of the meeting, finally spoke up. "This isn't just about security lapses," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "This man had a purpose. He was targeting Naomi. The question is, why? Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as everyone exchanged uneasy glances. Eleanor cleared her throat, bringing the discussion back into focus. "We need to act quickly," she said. "Thomas, coordinate with local authorities. Henry, I want you to leave the security detail for Naomi. Make sure she's protected at all times." Henry nodded, his expression resolute. Naomi wasn't sure how she felt about him being responsible for her safety, but she didn't have the energy to protest. The situation was spiraling, and she needed all the help she could get. That evening, as Naomi tried to settle into her apartment, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short but chilling. "You don't know the whole story. Meet me at the old chapel on Brook Street at midnight if you want answers." Her heart pounded as she read the message over and over, her mind racing. Was this from the hooded man? Or someone else entirely? It felt like a trap. But the promise of answers was too tempting to ignore. She hesitated before calling Robert and telling him about the message. "You're not going alone," Robert said firmly. "I'll meet you there, and we'll let security know. If this is a setup, we'll be ready." Midnight came quickly, and Naomi found herself standing in front of the old, crumbling chapel on Brook Street. The air was cold, and the street was eerily quiet, the faint sound of distant traffic, the only sign of life. Robert stood beside her, his presence reassuring. Henry and a few other guards were stationed nearby, watching from the shadows. The door to the chapel creaked open, and a figure stepped out. It was the hooded man, his face still obscured by the shadows. He stopped a few feet away, his posture tense. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But you need to know the truth." Naomi's throat tightened. "What truth?" she demanded, her voice trembling but determined. "Why have you been following me?" The man hesitated, then slowly pulled back his hood, revealing a face Naomi didn't recognize. He looked older than she expected, his weathered features etched with a mix of pain and urgency. "My name is Daniel," he said, "and I knew your grandmother." The revelation hit her like a bolt of lightning. "My grandmother," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Daniel took a step closer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Your grandmother was more than just a servant in the palace," he said. "She was involved in something dangerous. She uncovered secrets about the royal family, secrets that could have destroyed them. But before she could expose the truth, she disappeared." Naomi felt her legs weaken, the weight of his words threatening to overwhelm her. "Disappeared," she echoed, her mind struggling to process the implications. "What does this have to do with me?" "Because you're her blood," Daniel replied, his voice urgent. "And I think someone in the palace believes you might know what she knew. That's why they're watching you, why they're trying to intimidate you." Naomi's world tilted on its axis. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The picture they created was more terrifying than she could have imagined. Before she could respond, a loud noise shattered the stillness. A car screeched to a halt nearby, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the street. Henry and his team sprang into action, their movements swift and precise. "Get her out of here," Henry barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Naomi felt Robert grab her arm, pulling her towards safety as the hooded man. Daniel disappeared into the shadows. The night was a blur of adrenaline and fear. By the time Naomi was safely back at the palace, her mind was reeling. She didn't know who to trust, what to believe. But one thing was clear. Her grandmother's story wasn't over. And now it was up to Naomi to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As she sat in the quiet of her room, her thoughts racing, her phone buzzed with another message. This time, it was a photo, a faded image of her grandmother standing beside a young Daniel, both of them smiling, their eyes full of secrets Naomi was only beginning to uncover. The message that accompanied the photo was simple but chilling. The past never stays buried. Naomi stared at the photo on her phone, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. Her grandmother had always been a quiet, gentle presence in her life, someone who rarely spoke about the past, much less anything that hinted at danger or intrigue. Now this image, combined with Daniel's cryptic words, painted a vastly different picture. What secrets had her grandmother uncovered, and why had they been dangerous enough to haunt Naomi decades later? The next morning, Eleanor called a private meeting in one of the palace's more secluded rooms. Naomi, Robert, Henry, and Thomas were present, their expressions sullen. Security had been heightened overnight, and the palace was on high alert. Eleanor began by addressing the group, her tone steady but serious. Last night's events have made one thing clear, she said. This isn't just about an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. Naomi's connection to her grandmother has placed her at the center of something much bigger. We need to uncover the truth, not only to ensure Naomi's safety, but to address whatever is threatening the integrity of this institution. Thomas revealed more about what he had found in the archives. Among the old records, he had discovered cryptic notes from Naomi's grandmother, Edith. The notes were vague, hinting at discrepancies in financial ledgers and unexplained meetings between high-ranking officials. While nothing outright incriminating, the pattern suggested that Edith had stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to see. Henry leaned forward, his expression unusually thoughtful. If Edith was trying to expose something, it means she believed it was worth the risk. But it also means she wasn't working alone. Someone must have known what she was doing. Naomi's voice was quiet but resolute. Daniel knew her. He said she was trying to uncover secrets that could destroy the royal family. But if that's true, why would he warn me? Why follow me instead of confronting whoever is behind this? Robert chimed in, his tone measured. Maybe he's trying to protect you. If he's been on the run all these years, he might know the danger you're in better than anyone. The conversation paused as Naomi absorbed their words. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, determination, and a deep longing to understand her grandmother's legacy. Despite the uncertainty, one thing was clear. She couldn't turn away from this now. That afternoon, Naomi and Henry reviewed the last of the records Thomas had unearthed. One document caught Naomi's attention, a hand-drawn map of the palace grounds with a small X marked near the East Wing garden. It was in Edith's handwriting, dated just a week before her disappearance. Naomi's heart raced as she traced her finger over the map. "What's here?" she asked, pointing to the X. Henry frowned, studying the map. "That area used to house a small gardener's shed," he said. "It was torn down years ago, but if Edith marked it, she must have thought it was important." Determined to find answers, Naomi and Henry went to the East Wing garden that evening, accompanied by Robert. They searched the area where the shed once stood, guided by the dim light of a flashlight. After nearly an hour of searching, Henry's foot hit something solid beneath the dirt. He crouched down, brushing away the soil to reveal a rusted metal box. Naomi's hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside were faded photographs, letters, and a small leather-bound journal. The letters were written in Edith's careful script, addressed to someone named Dee. Naomi's breath caught as she realized the connection. He was Daniel. The journal detailed Edith's discoveries. She had found evidence of embezzlement within the palace finances, orchestrated by a group of powerful insiders. Fearing exposure, they had silenced Edith, making her disappearance look like a tragic accident. The letters revealed that Daniel, a young footman at the time, had been her confidant and ally. When Edith vanished, Daniel fled, taking with him the knowledge of her findings. Naomi's hands tightened around the journal. Her grandmother had risked everything to uncover the truth, and now it was Naomi's turn to finish what she started. But before she could process the weight of her discovery, a rustling noise broke the stillness of the garden. The group turned, their flashlights catching the figure of Daniel emerging from the shadows. "I knew you'd find it," he said, his voice steady, but laced with sadness. "Edith trusted you, even if she never got the chance to tell you herself." Naomi stood, her heart pounding. "Why didn't you come forward sooner? Why follow me instead of sharing the truth?" Daniel sighed, the years of guilt and fear evident in his expression. "Because I didn't know who I could trust. The people responsible for Edith's death are still powerful. I wanted to make sure you were ready to handle the truth before I put you in harm's way. Naomi felt a surge of anger and determination. I deserve to know the truth about my family. I won't let fear silence me like it did for so long. With the journal and letters in hand, Naomi returned to the palace, where Eleanor promised to launch an independent investigation. The documents were handed over to trusted authorities, and the wheels of justice began to turn. Over the following weeks, revelations about the embezzlement scandal made headlines, forcing those involved to face accountability. For Naomi, the journey had been transformative. She had come to the palace seeking connection, and found herself uncovering a legacy of courage and resilience. Her grandmother's story, once buried in silence, was finally being told. As Naomi stood in the East Wing garden one last time, she felt a sense of peace. The garden, once a place of mystery, had become a symbol of her grandmother's strength. She glanced at Daniel, who stood quietly beside her, his presence a reminder of the sacrifices made to bring the truth to light. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude, "for everything." Daniel nodded, his eyes misty. "Your grandmother would be proud of you." As Naomi left the palace that day, she carried with her not only the truth about her family, but also a renewed sense of purpose. Her grandmother's courage had inspired her to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. And while the past had left its scars, it had also given her the strength to face the future with unwavering resolve. The story of Edith and Naomi was no longer a secret. It was a testament to the power of truth and the enduring legacy of those who dare to seek it.